Hello everyone, I'm Wendy Ray, and I'm General Counsel with the Ontario Ombudsman's Office, and this is Laura Pettigrew, and she's also General Counsel with the Ombudsman's Office. We've both been with the office for over 25 years, and I think between the two of us, we have done every job in the office, and I mean every job in the office. Hopefully we'll be able to answer all your questions. We have, besides Laura and I being involved in investigations, and Laura's done a lot of report writing, we do a lot of investigation training, and we've both done that training for people locally, nationally, internationally. So that's sort of what our expertise is. Now we're dealing with a university setting, and this is relatively new to us and relatively new to you. So I hope we can have a really good session this morning. It looks like it's a small enough group that really you can be asking questions all along, and that way we can ensure that we're dealing with what you're interested in. We do have a presentation, but we can go off topic if we need to. Because I want to make sure that when you leave this session, you have all your questions answered. For the first part of the presentation, I'm just going to be talking about what an ombudsman is, how our office works, what happens when a complaint comes in, how we get those complaints. And for the second part, Laura's going to talk about the work we've done with the university since we got jurisdiction January 1st, 2016. But saying that, once again, if there's something that you want to focus on or deal with, please just let us know. The other thing is I poured water all over my presentation, so at least it wasn't the computer. Okay, so an ombudsman. What is an ombudsman? An ombudsman, the concept of an ombudsman, or modern day ombudsman, is really from Sweden. Around, I think 1809 was the first Swedish ombudsman. And an ombudsman is a citizen's representative. The ombudsman is a Swedish word. It's gender neutral, so women can be ombudsmen. We've had in Ontario, Roberta Jameson was our ombudsman. I was acting ombudsman at one point. But more and more you're seeing people use words like ombuds or ombudswoman. And I think it's just because even the word itself can be hard to say for some people. And when you see a woman, you say ombudsman. So, but all those mean the same thing, citizens representative. And it's interesting because out of the 21 publicly funded universities that the Ontario Ombudsman has jurisdiction over, there are 12 university ombudsmen that also exist. So although, and I want to explain what the difference between sort of an Ontario Ombudsman and a university ombudsman or a municipal ombudsman. So there are different kinds of ombudsmen. Our office, the ombudsman is appointed as, it's referred to as a classical ombudsman model. He's appointed through the Legislative Assembly, so either a legislative ombudsman or a parliamentary ombudsman, and they have total independence from the organizations that they oversee. So we have nothing to do with the provincial, we aren't part of the provincial government. We're not part of school boards, we're not part of municipalities, we are not part of universities. We are totally independent. And that's what you refer to as a classical or parliamentary ombudsman. You then get some ombudsmen who are appointed, they're referred to as executive ombudsmen, and at the federal level we have ombudsmen like the federal taxpayer ombudsman, and they report through a ministry. So there's a little less independence because that they have to report through the head of who they oversee, right? And then you get ombudsmen, local ombudsmen like university ombudsman or municipal ombudsman, the Ontario Hydro One ombudsman, and they are actually part of the organization that they oversee in most cases. There are some university ombudsmen who are sort of outside that sphere because they are actually set up through the student union or through the student body. And then there are some mixed university ombudsmen that are mixtures between the university and the student body. And so depending on how they're set up, they have a little bit more or a little bit less independence from the organization that they oversee. Is that clear as mud? Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to go through what an ombudsman is. Now, Paul Dubé is the current Ontario Ombudsman, and he was appointed April 1st, 2016, sorry. And our office has been around for 40 years, so over 40 years. So we have a lot of experience in ombudsmanship. The nice thing about the appointment of Paul was he was the former taxpayers ombudsman. And so when he came into this role, he already knew what this business was all about. He was already, an investigator, and he was able to hit the ground running. So that was really important to us because at the same time, we were just getting jurisdiction over municipalities, universities, and school boards. And that was a whole new area for us, considering most of the previous 30-something years, we were just investigating the provincial government. So, who we oversee. There, maybe that's better. So, we oversee over 1,000 different organizations. So, in the provincial government sphere, it's ministries, corporations, agencies, boards, commissions, tribunals. With school boards, we have jurisdiction over 82 school boards. With municipalities, 444. And then with the universities, it was very specific in the legislation. It referred to universities receiving regular, direct operating funding from the government, from the provincial government. So we had to take a look at all the different universities, and some of you have affiliates, some of you, have other bodies that are attached to you, and depending how they're set up and how your university deals with those, we have jurisdiction over most of the programs, but maybe not all. So every time we get a complaint, we look to see what it is that's being complained about and make that determination. And over the years, we'll get better and better at it. Yes?
The hospitals and healthcare not in that at all?
So what happened was when the government decided they were going to expand oversight, what they did was they split off hospitals and CASs and long-term care. So what they did was they gave the provincial ombudsman, municipalities, universities, and school boards, they created a patient ombudsman who looks at hospitals, long-term care homes, and part of the local health network sector. And for children's aid, they gave that to the provincial advocate who deals with, is an advocate for children and youth. So that's how they split up all the different areas.
Just a quick question. Universities are listed there, colleges aren't?
We've always had jurisdiction over the colleges from the
Okay.
very beginning, from the way colleges were set up. It's never been an issue. Yeah. So we have the authority to investigate. that my paper's dried off a bit, I can actually take a look at my notes. So we are an independent and impartial investigation body. Okay, so as we go through this, keep remembering independent and impartial. Because I think that's key, and I think that's something that is, we have to spend a lot of time managing expectations when we do get complaints. People think we're advocates, and we're not. That's somebody else, not us. So the Ombudsman can investigate complaints brought forward by individuals. We can also investigate complaints from members of provincial parliament. And under the Ombudsman Act, the Ombudsman has authority to conduct own motions. And that means that if he is aware of a particular issue and somebody hasn't actually come forward to our office, but he knows that it's impacting a person or body of persons in a way that is affecting the person through the acts, omissions, recommendations, or decisions of a public sector body like the university, he can start his own investigation. The other thing is, a lot of the work that you'll see coming out of our office, the more public work, is also systemic in nature, so we do a lot of systemic investigations, and I'll be talking about that more later on. Our services are free, and we have a staff of about just over 100 right now, but we are, when we got the increase in jurisdiction, we also got an increase in the number of FTEs that we have, so we are continuing to hire, and all of our staff operate under delegations from the Ombudsman. So that's how the work is actually carried out on a day-to-day basis. So there is something called, I'm sorry, my screen isn't changing, so I have to keep looking up here. So there's a piece of legislation called the Ombudsman Act, and that's where we get all our authority from. And one of the things about ombudsmen, even at the university level, but I think across the board, is ombudsmen are supposed to be considered offices of last resort. So if there is an appeal mechanism or an internal complaints process, the expectation is always that somebody tries to deal with their issues internally, work their way up through the process. And it's only if they can't get their issue resolved do they go to the university ombudsman, and then if they're not satisfied or there isn't a university ombudsman or complaint mechanism, they can come to our office. So through the provisions in our legislation, that I didn't go through them, but basically that's what it means. And we also have very broad discretion not to investigate. So we cannot investigate for reasons that there's an adequate alternative remedy, something that the person can do internally, or complaint is frivolous, vexatious, not made in good faith, or delay in coming to our office where at this point it wouldn't make any difference for us to go forward with an investigation. And then we have something that we refer to the basket clause, given the circumstances of the case. So we might just look at the circumstances of the case and say, you know what, this is what the policy said, this is what the organization did, this is how they communicated it to you, they followed all their process, they were clear in their communication. Given that, we're not going to go forward with any investigation, right? So that's how we use our discretion. Now, if we are going to do a formal investigation, you will always know about it beforehand, because we'll have been making inquiries, we'll have been speaking to people, and if we need to go formal, and I'll tell you when we might do that, the head of the university would receive a notice of our intent to investigate. Saying all that, Two things I'd like to emphasize, and I saw a lot of different universities were here, but I wasn't able to go around the room just before we started. But we really encourage ombudsman at the university level. I know there's 12 right now, but if anybody, any other university is looking to put a process like that in place, I know there's materials out there that talk about how to go about doing something like that, and there's supports for you for setting up a ombudsman at the university level. The other thing, I'm going to be talking about formal investigations and our powers, but the majority of our work, and I mean the majority of our work, is done informally. We get over 20,000 complaints a year, and there are maybe a few handfuls of investigations done formally every year, and since having jurisdiction over universities, we have not done one formal investigation in the university sector as of yet. So I just wanted to put that into perspective for you. So, but if we were going to do a formal investigation, here are some of the powers under our Act. With organizations that we have authority over, officials, persons, employees have to provide us with information, and that's under the Act. We could also summons information if we think we want to go that route, not only from those people who work for those jurisdictional bodies, but from anybody we think might have relevant information. We also have the authority to enter into premises if we need to. I've got to tell you, we're usually always invited in. The few times we've used that power of entry had to do when we've been looking at living conditions, because we also have authority over the provincial correctional institutions and places like that. There's also an offense provision, and I think the purpose of the offense provision really demonstrates how serious the legislature was about providing an office like ours to do this kind of work. And if you don't cooperate or you're dishonest or things like that during an investigation, it is a provincial offense. You can be fined up to $500 or go to prison for 3 months. So it's there. In all the years we've been there, and from what our understanding is, it has never been used, because I've got to tell you, we usually have really good cooperation with the organizations we have jurisdiction over. And we do that by things like this. We're building relationships. We're getting out there so that you know who we are, what we do, and how we can work together to really come to win-win situations. And if any of you would like somebody from our office to come out and meet with senior people at your university or particular groups, you can just let our communications department know, and we can set something up like that for you. My pages are stuck together here. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is our authority is over administrative conduct. And what that means, or the words used in the Act, means that we can look at decisions, recommendations, omissions, or acts of those public sector bodies that we have authority over. And in a university setting, that would look like, do you have systems in place to deal with issues that people might have? Do you have policies or procedures? Were those followed in situations where somebody came forward to utilize those policies and procedures? Were outcomes communicated to the individual? Those are the kinds of administrative things that we might look at. Does anybody have any questions about that? Laura will give you more examples, I think, when she starts to talk about our role with universities. So, the other thing that, remember I told you we're impartial and independent? So for us, when we talk about resolutions of complaints, what we're referring to is the Ombudsman is satisfied that the matter is resolved. It does not necessarily mean that the complainant who comes forward to us is satisfied. And we have to spend time up front when we get complaints managing people's expectations, because we still are seen as an advocate organization up there, and we're not. And we don't apologize for government or public sector organizations, and we don't represent the complainant. The only time you'll see an ombudsman become an advocate is after a full investigation where recommendations are made, and at that point, the ombudsman will be advocating for those recommendations to be accepted, and that's really, he's advocating for fairness at that point. So the ombudsman can't make orders, and that's confusing for people because they want people fired, they want decisions changed, they want. And what the ombudsman can do, however, if he finds there's an issue, he can make conclusions about what happened and recommendations. And one of the strongest powers that an ombudsman has, and I think this is also university ombudsman, is because they're not making orders, but they can make reports, and they can make those reports and provide them to the people that they need to go to, and in our case, we can make those reports public. And if those recommendations aren't followed, then really it becomes the court of public opinion that can take over. And I've got to say, in like 99% of our recommendations have been accepted in the last 10-15 years. So I think that talks about the kind of work we do, and also how we work with organizations to make sure that recommendations make sense, they make sense for your organization, and there's something that can be implemented and make change for the better. So, who you might be hearing from. There are 4 different teams in our office that deal with operations or complaints. Early resolutions team, the investigations team, the special ombudsman response team, or SORT, we call them for short, and the legal team. And when complaints come into our office, we do triage them, because we also get complaints that might involve issues of life, death, health, safety. I mean, if we got a complaint from a student, for example, who was threatening bodily harm to themselves or to somebody else, like, that goes right to the front of the line, and we start making calls. Even if their complaint was about, say, appeal of their marks, and there's an appeal mechanism internally to go through, you would hear from us early on, and somebody would take that complaint right away. So the early resolution officers, so we get these complaints, right? They come in through mail, fax, web mail, and we have people who walk into the office, provide these complaints, and we take a look at them. If they're more interesting cases that can't just be resolved like right away, we have flag teams, and we have a particular flag team for universities. So that issue will go around to a group of us who have spent more time looking at the university complaints, and because we have a real team approach, and we'll work together to figure out where that complaint should go and what we should be doing with it. Most of our complaints are resolved within 2 weeks, 60% of them. And remember what I said about what resolution means. A resolution for us might also mean we've looked at the complaint and there is a proper referral back to the university setting, and that's where we would tell the person that's where they could go to have their complaint dealt with. If they still had concerns, they could come back to us at the end of the process. So how early resolutions work. This is a team of about 40, at some point soon to be 50 individuals. They are highly trained. A lot of them are professionals, lawyers, social workers, different kinds of backgrounds. And so it's not a call center. Their work is to actually take the complaint, get the details from the individual, get any relevant documentation, figure out, do research, figure out what the law is, what the policies are in those particular areas. And they then, in some cases, just find out, you know what, it's premature to come to us, give them the referral. Or in other cases, they read everything and it looks like everything's been done the way it should be done. The policies are clear, they were communicated well, they can close that complaint. But sometimes we're only getting one half of the story, right? We're getting it from the complainant, and we need to make inquiries to find out, is there any more documentation? What happened when that person spoke with you? You know, the other side of the story. And so you'll be getting calls. The majority of calls would be from early resolution officers because they need to verify the information before they close that complaint. Now, before making an inquiry with you about an individual, they always get consent, and it's documented on our file that it's okay for us to contact you, and if you ever need that consent down the line, we'd be able to provide it to you. But it's done orally. What else can I- Now, one of the things is because we're still learning about your organizations, you might be getting more calls now than you might 2 years from now, because we're building our knowledge about each university is run differently, and you have different processes and different policies. So we're still building that knowledge base. We do have an internal tool that we use. It's on a wiki platform, just like Wikipedia, where all the information we do gather, if there's a new policy that we find out about or a good contact person in a particular office, we put that on the wiki, and so the next time we make an inquiry, we know who might be a good person to talk with, and we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So that's how we deal with our knowledge base growing in this area. So we're getting in all these 20,000 plus complaints a year, and we track them. And we also look for trends. And the people on the flag teams have an idea of what kinds of issues are coming forward. And this is how we determine if we need to perhaps do some proactive ombudsman work and go out to an organization and say, you know what, we're seeing a trend in this area and we don't know why it's happening. Are you aware of this? Is this something that you think you need to look into? Or do we start needing to look at these complaints individually? Or It's also the basis of some of our special ombudsman response team investigations. I can give you an example. A few years ago, when we still had jurisdiction over Hydro One, we were seeing a number of complaints coming in, and we were getting concerned about it. And so we contacted the organization, and we decided we were going to meet on a regular basis so they could they were changing one of their computer system, and that we could meet on a regular basis, and they could provide us updates and let us know what's happening as they're tracking the changes going on, so we'd be aware of the process. And we met a few times over periods of months, and and then by the summer, they reassured us that by the fall, by September, everything would be where it should be and things would be improving. September rolls around, the complaints are just, they're really increasing. We're concerned. We decide to do a systemic investigation. And it was during that investigation where we had thousands and thousands and thousands of emails. One of the emails that we saw said, you know what, we're meeting with the Ombudsman. I don't think we should tell them about what's going on and why this is happening. And and that was pretty, here we were trying to be out there to try and get these things resolved informally. And we couldn't understand why the numbers were increasing in terms of complaints. And the organization wasn't coming forth with the information that they actually had. And that ended up being a huge investigation. In the end, we had over 10,000 complaints that particular year and a half. So, and it wasn't out of us not trying to work together with the organization. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm really encouraging you to work openly and honestly with us, because I think most of our great work is done that way. If an early resolution officer has been working up a complaint and still thinks there might be concerns, we have a weekly meeting with senior management and the Ombudsman, the Deputy Ombudsman, myself, other directors, and we bring those cases forward. We talk about what should be the next steps. Sometimes, you know what, the Ombudsman's satisfied, we close it. In other cases, we think more work needs to be done. Those cases can either stay with the early resolution officer or be transferred to one of the other teams. And even if it is transferred to investigations, it doesn't mean we then automatically start a formal investigation. We still try and resolve those complaints informally, but what we might do is more interviews, collect more documentation, speak to other people who might have been involved. It does take more time, but it's much more focused at this point. If it can't be resolved, that's when it will likely go to a formal investigation. But even before we do that, we try to escalate up the hierarchy. So if we've been dealing with, say, a frontline manager in an organization, we might then speak to the director. And then if we still don't think it's resolved after speaking with the director, we might speak with, well, I can tell you in the provincial sphere, it would be the assistant deputy minister or the deputy minister. And in the university, depending on where the complaint or what the complaint is about, which route it would be sort of up to the top of the university before it became, we make that decision to start a formal investigation. And if there is a formal investigation, like I said, there will be a notice of intent to investigate. We'll have already worked on an investigation plan. We send something out called wish list letters, and those are to the organization saying the kinds of documents we're looking for. And those usually follow really quickly after the notice of intent to investigate. And one of the things that you'll always find in those letters are any other relevant documents to the particular issue. And so we're expecting everything and anything relating to that issue. And we don't necessarily take kindly if we don't get everything. Okay, and like I said, you must comply with that request. Now, our investigations, under our act, it actually says our investigations are conducted in private. So when we're doing our work, we have confidentiality provisions that we work under. The only time we would talk about things, like I was talking about that email from the Hydro example I gave, was because that information was found in the report and it had been made public under our reporting provisions. Otherwise, all our work is confidential. We are not subject to freedom of information. So although sometimes people try and get information from us that way, they can't. And we don't get our information under freedom of information legislation as well. Okay. So investigations done. What does the Ombudsman do? Under the Act, the Ombudsman can make conclusions and recommendations, and they can be quite broad. I'm just going to give you some language of the conclusions. It says, including that a decision, recommendation, act, or omission appears to have been contrary to law, unreasonable, unjust, oppressive, improperly discriminatory. So you're getting the idea, really broad-based conclusions, and the same with the recommendations. Now, what we do is the investigation is completed. We do have a preliminary report. That preliminary report is sent to the organization. You get an opportunity to review that. It's a confidential process, so people can't, even though it's in your hands, people can't get a copy of it under freedom of information. Your organization can meet in private. You have to meet in private to discuss the report, and then you can come back to us with any, if you've identified any errors, any concerns, anything that you think we need to be aware of. We will take that into consideration, and then we will prepare a final report. Once that final report is done, we send it back to you, and at that point, we can make it public. Okay. And that's whether you accept those recommendations or not. We also, just to give you an idea, in those reports, one of the sections that you always will see is the cooperation we had during those investigations. And most of the time, it's really nice to say we've had full cooperation, but there are some times where we've had to bring it to the attention of the organization that we haven't. And so you'll find that in the report as well. Yes?
I'm just wondering, does your office directly liaise with the president of the institution, or is it with the person that the complaint is being brought against?
Okay.
So who in the institution is the contact, or is it different across the board?
It's different across the board, but it usually starts with, at the early resolution officer, we're usually speaking to the person who had contact with the individual. And then we work our way up, and if need be, we'd speak to the president. But if you have, for example, a complaints process or ombudsman office internally, what we would do is we'd be speaking to that person. If it is somebody that we have jurisdiction over, like I said, there are some universities where they're sort of outside of the university, that ombudsman position. And we'd be speaking with them. And we wouldn't necessarily have to go back to the very beginning, because we're an office of last resort, and if it could have been resolved going through the process, we're more interested in that last contact that they've had with your organization. So say if there's appeal of a grade right through to the Senate, we wouldn't be looking at what happened along the way. We'd be looking at that decision at that level. Okay, and I'm almost finished, Laura. And this, I just want to talk briefly about our SORT investigations, because these are the ones, if you've heard about our office, a lot of times it's because of these investigations. We've done probably over 40 since 2005, and these investigations usually end up in public reports that are out in the media. They have made huge impacts on all sorts of areas in the province. I'm sure that millions of Ontarians have been affected by the outcome of these reports, and there's been huge systemic changes to organizations because of these reports. Just to give you a quick idea, does anybody play the lottery here? No? So, okay. So, a number of years ago, we did an investigation to the Ontario Lottery Corporation, and the issue was that it looked like people who were selling tickets were winning statistically, like, in a way that was really improbable, more than the general public who were buying tickets. And they were called insider wins. And the corporation was actually aware that there was an issue about this, but they weren't really doing anything about it. They were seeing those themselves as even though we were part of a government organization, they were seeing themselves as a corporation out there to make money, and more like not considering the public good that I think a public organization usually keeps front and foremost. Because one of the things is with the Lottery Corporation, they get millions of dollars that they put back into our hospitals and into different programs in the province. And you've got to make sure that people are buying tickets to be able to do that. And if they don't have trust in the lottery process, they're not going to buy tickets. And at the end of the day, now if you go to buy a ticket, do you notice that you have to sign the tickets if you ever win anything? And they're self-checkers? Yeah. And that's because of this investigation. But bigger than that, we also found that there was one case where somebody claimed a 12 million plus ticket, and it was a stolen ticket. Yeah, and I mean, I can get into more detail about that, but just to give you an idea of some of the kind of work we do. There's also, if any of you have had children in Ontario, and there's about 128,000 live births every year, we also, we were one of the first jurisdictions in 1959 to start testing for two diseases. You know when they do the blood pinprick at the heel of a baby when they're born? And in 2005, we became aware that we were still just doing the two diseases, and most countries, first world countries, were testing for about 27 back then, and even places like Costa Rica. And the technology and the machines to do that testing were being shipped from Ontario, and we were still just testing for those two diseases. And by the end of that investigation, we now, like today, every baby's tested for 29 different diseases. But we had to bring that to the forefront through an investigation. So those are the big investigations that we do, and usually you see those on the front page of the newspapers or on the news when you're watching it. But that's a small part of our work. The majority of our work is done informally, and we get resolutions every day. I will pass it on to Laura. That's not working, so you have to look. Oh, okay. All right, I'm just going to very quickly
go through some of the statistics and talk about a few of the cases that we've had relating specifically to universities. I'm going in the wrong direction. Okay, so we've had jurisdiction since January 2016, and to put this into context, we get about 20,000 complaints and inquiries a year. Since January 2016, we have, as of February 14th, Valentine's Day, had 505 complaints about universities. In that time, we have actually closed about 430. So about 85% have been closed. We've still got 50% open. All of those, as Wendy indicated, have been resolved to our satisfaction informally. In many cases, it's just referring people back to the appropriate appeal mechanism. If there's an ombudsman's office at the university, we'll refer people back there. As Wendy mentioned, if you have a university ombudsman, and it's something we encourage universities to have, we would first ensure that the student has engaged with that ombudsman and they've completed their process before we would normally engage in making inquiries. This is an idea of the where complaints are coming from. Unsurprising, most are from the students, but we do get a fair number from faculty and staff. In some cases, it has to do with labor and employment relations matters, and in those situations, we generally be referring people to associations to resolve their concerns. 5% are from the community, and you ask, well, what circumstances may complaints arising related to the community? Things like parking. These are the types of complaints that we've received relating to universities. It's very similar to our experience with colleges. As Wendy mentioned, for over 40 years we've had jurisdiction of colleges, very similar in the types of complaints. In many cases, what we find actually across the board with complaints, most complaints stem from communication issues, and we're very good at facilitating communication between individuals and institutions. In the university context, we've had complaints about academic accommodations, financial aid, student government, which we have no jurisdiction to deal with, parking, admissions. In a number of cases, it's got to do with what we call procedural fairness. Someone's complaining about, say, a university appeal process, and we find that it may need some tweaking, better communication, clearer wording, for instance. We have had some complaints about graduate supervision, which often raises interesting issues. I think you should be aware that under our legislation, Section 30 of the Ombudsman Act, we have to keep in mind principles of academic freedom. We have to take them into consideration when dealing with things. So if somebody comes forward with a complaint that they have a conflict with a graduate supervisor, for instance, what we're looking at is not that relationship and the discretion and freedom that the professor may have relating to assessing a particular student. We're looking at what kind of conflict procedures does the university have? Do they have it? And have they been followed in a particular case? And that is really the lens that we are looking at that from in terms of administrative conduct and fairness. A couple of the cases that have arisen in the short time we've had jurisdiction, I'm going to just give you a couple of examples from our latest annual report. A student came to us and he was complaining that the university had failed to respond to him on various issues. He had a grade appeal, a request for a bursary, and a refund. So we looked at it, we followed our early resolution process, we made several inquiries with individuals at the university who had information about this, and ultimately found that there was a little bit of a miscommunication, that there could have been more done by the university to communicate with the student about these issues. And as a result, the university undertook to write the student to explain the university's position and explain what actions they had taken. And as far as we were concerned, that's resolved. In another case, a student had come to us, they had been expelled from the university for academic fraud. And this is one where the ombudsman had become involved in the matter. So our first stage at that point would have been we talk to the ombudsman, we look at what they have recommended. And there was still some concern about what had happened with that process and the fairness of the process. So what we did is we we went to the university, we had some discussions and we had a meeting. And when we looked at the process that they had relevant to discipline documentation and policies, we felt that more could be done in terms of providing guidance for the decision-making bodies within the university dealing with discipline matters. And the university agreed that that was the case and undertook to do some development in that area. In another case, we had a PhD student who came to us. He had failed his final exam on his first try after 16 months of coursework and was wanting an opportunity to try it again. He wasn't getting anywhere with the university. We made some inquiries, we looked at the policy, and we actually found that the university policy had been misapplied in that particular case. And as a result, he had a chance to appeal the matter further. This is a case about money. And it had to do with a distance education student who came to us and said, you know what, I have to pay all these fees for matters relating to living on campus, even though I live off campus, like student lifestyle fees. Is there anything I can do? But we were able to actually refer him to information available through the university about compulsory and non-compulsory fees, and provided him with information so he could then undertake the steps necessary to get a refund of those. So a lot of what we do, as Wendy indicated, is we have all sorts of referral information about policies and programs that's available through the universities, and we can direct people to those resources. Universities may not even know that a complaint has been received. Yes, I see a question back there.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is something your office might do, but if a department or university was interested in reforming policy internally, and we wanted advice on how to, like best practices in strong policy, would we be able to reach out to your office to ensure that these sorts of things don't actually come up?
We can provide sort of general information. We can't sort of rubber stamp,
of course, right.
Particular policies. One of the things that we are working towards, and we've done in other areas, for instance, municipalities, we've provided a lot of tip sheets for information. You have an internal complaints policy, for instance. What are best practices to adopt in developing those? We're looking at things like no trespass notices that are issued in municipalities, school boards, and may have applications as well for universities, developing some really simple but key elements that should be considered whenever you're developing those kinds of policies. So sometimes we can provide some guidance. It really depends on the nature of the policy that's being developed. This is something we say to organize all organizations, and equally applies to all organizations we have jurisdiction with. We really depend on the cooperation to be able to resolve complaints effectively and efficiently for the benefit of everybody involved, and we have been very successful in doing so. If we do get a little bit more formal in terms of asking for information and documents, we usually say, can you get it by a certain date? And we appreciate you cooperating with that. If you can't, then we would appreciate knowing as soon as possible when you might expect the information. As Wendy has indicated, when we're talking about university, we're usually going to the last level that's dealt with the matter. If it's gone through the whole appeal process, it would be the final level of appeal we'd be looking at. And we would also often be dealing with the Ombudsman, if there was an Ombudsman, to find out what their involvement was in the matter. We can also sometimes deal with complaints about local ombudsman. It really depends on how they've been created, as Wendy has indicated. In the university sector, the dozen or so ombudsmen that are out there have been constituted in different ways. So it really depends on their level of independence, whether or not we could review anything they did. And our review would be, again, very limited. We are looking more at process and fairness, how they followed their own policies and process, if they give an explanation to a student, for instance, about what's happened in a clear and well-reasoned way. So I think that's basically our presentation. Just to emphasize, we really encourage that universities have complaint resolution mechanisms and ombudsman. We don't advocate for complainants. We're independent, we're impartial. And we don't investigate every complaint. In fact, we don't investigate most of the complaints coming forward. It's usually in cases where it's a really intractable issue, they're not getting the cooperation, or it's just something that is so systemic and so important that we feel that we have to elevate it to an investigation. And we don't duplicate the work of university ombudsman or university processes, appeal processes. And we like to keep the channel of communication open.